Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 23 cheat sheet. So thank you guys so much for watching. I did miss last week's video, unfortunately, because I was working late in the office, but I was able to catch all the games this week. And of course, the cheat sheet has been updated for all the double game weeks in the future, specifically around Game Week 25, where we now have the Liverpool and Arsenal doubles. But that also means that Everton and Wolves will be doubling, where we have some potential enabling defenders that I will talk about later in this video. As far as the midfield position, I feel like it has become a bit more congested as of late because the top picks in the midfield are quite far and few, and it really is just about choosing the right Arsenal assets, which I'll talk about when I discuss picks within the Odegaard/Saka territory and how that kind of compares to, assets like Martinelli and Kedia. And of course, what you like to do with the defender with the Arsenal team. As far as Liverpool, I think we can obviously talk about going for Salah, Darwin, or Trent. A lot of people probably look forwards towards a double up of two of them. I would not really encourage going for three Liverpool. Simply put, they've been pretty woeful. We've already seen a result versus Wolves, although I think, of course, mirror matchups aren't very helpful in terms of informing us of the future. So for example, if you take the Leeds game as an example, I think United are probably going to do a little bit better than them when they play Leeds away, and I'm quite wary, of course, that a lot of people are thinking about moving away from Bruno Fernandes. I know it seems to make sense if you're going for moves like Mahrez and Odegaard, and I can understand that, or even Saka, but it's going to be quite a tough move to make because I think Bruno had such a great second half performance. Anyways, before I get carried away, let's actually get started with the cheaper midfielders. In terms of the 4.5 to 4.9 territory, I have Bailey and Andreas, no changes there. Bailey still is a great asset, specifically because of the way he covers Game Week 25. I'm not super fond of Bailey because I think Watkins is actually the prime asset to get when it comes to covering this Aston Villa attack. Neither do they have doubles, so it might be a little bit more interesting for us to save money. Think about what we can go towards when it comes to covering Everton and Wolves potentially, because we've of course had some new manager bounces. Whether Sean Dyche's bounce is going to be something a bit more permanent, we'll see. But it seems like, of course, Wolves are on track with Lopetegui, and I think it will be interesting to think about or dream up what are the best assets to go for if we're going for picks within the midfield and the forward positions for Wolves. Right now, I don't think anything is too appealing. But in terms of the 5.0 to 5.9 territory, I've got Mitoma at the top. I have actually separated him from March this week, so I have dropped March and kept Mitoma at the top. But I actually said 2 weeks ago when I made this decision between Mitoma and March, or at least was kind of encouraging and offering my insight on that, I did suggest that Mitoma was the better pick because I think he seems to be the more active player, the one who actually they try to play around in most games. But I have seen in recent games, of course, that March or even them playing on the right-hand side has occurred. You can also see that Lamptey coming into the team seems to have taken Estupiñán a little bit further back. Maybe that was tactical in a recent game, but I think that has been the slight change. I still think Mitoma is the more interesting asset. You're actually seeing him move towards the box and to be that sort of final man at times. And even though he even occupies arguably a left wing back position, I do think Mitoma is far and about the best asset. The finishing on display, the dribbling. Look, he's an electric player to have, and I'd try to get him now, or Game Week 24 specifically. And then I'd think about really getting him at Game Week 26. That's the kind of window that you have to get Mitoma as soon as possible, in my opinion, because Brighton will also have potential doubles even as soon as 26. As far as March, though, I think I'd still probably think towards Evan Ferguson if he actually comes back from injury first before moving there. I don't think a double up with the Brighton midfielder makes sense. I'd prioritize Mitoma there. However, you could obviously go for another Brighton defender, and that could be interesting. But I think defensively, I haven't seen too much from Brighton to be interested by. They did, of course, play Bournemouth, but I think that's one of those games where you'd expect the team, unfortunately, with the state of Bournemouth, to actually be able to get a clean sheet there. So I think Wolves, of course, is interesting when you're talking about assets like Kilman in 24. But from the defensive point of view, I think Brighton isn't a team that you need to absolutely clamor over unless they have a double-double, at which point, of course, you're going to go for a triple Brighton. Almiron, unfortunately, has to fall as well. He's been one of those assets where he hit a fantastic run of form, but the underlying stats did actually support him being a top asset. The key thing for Newcastle now, though, and the reason why I'm dropping him so significantly, is because the fixtures are quite tough. You've got a blank in the future, and of course, he plays Liverpool and Man City. Now, Liverpool haven't shown anything to suggest that they're going to keep a clean sheet versus Newcastle. Could be a great game for a fixture for Almiron, but I think this is potentially the time to think about moving away from Almiron, or at least holding off that transfer. You can maybe move in a kind of side grade move towards someone like Mitoma, who's in great form, has better fixtures as well, and impending doubles. So that's the interest for me as to why Almiron has dropped. As far as 6.0 to 6.9 assets, this is where Grealish and Martinelli stand, because Odegaard and of course Rashford have moved away and leapt away into that kind of 7.0 plus territory. I think Grealish is not going to be one of those top assets. I think he's actually Pep's most nailed man when it comes to the attackers. We saw Mahrez get subbed off at around 59 minutes for Kevin De Bruyne, and so that's going to tell you that, especially with Champions League coming up, Mr. Champions League Mahrez is probably going to be playing less minutes for the City team. Now, another thing to think about with City is on Game Week 28, you're going to have a blank there. So you might want to think about whether you truly want to have triple City. Now, they do have great fixtures. Nottingham Forest and Bournemouth are great games. But I think a lot of people are going for a setup where they have 2 attackers and 1 defender. And I think 1 defender doesn't feel fantastic right now. I think that's one move you can move away from, whereas 2 attackers for City still seems very appealing because of the fixtures at hand, even if you have to kind of move away in Game Week 28. Now, a lot of people are probably going to be moving for something like Salah from De Bruyne in Game Week 25, and that's going to be a very possible move, a very good one, I would say. But if you're holding for someone like Grealish, I think I'd still prefer someone like Mahrez, because I think he's much more direct when it comes to whether he actually takes his defender on and actually cracks on a couple shots on target. Grealish is someone who actually has been quite encouraging from recent games, but I would still probably say that Mahrez is a better finisher. I've got a little bit more faith in him from that point of view, and overall, I think Mahrez is kind of that high variance pick that you want to bank on, whereas Grealish is a little bit more dull, I would say. And unfortunately, I probably wouldn't think about Grealish as an exciting transfer, because the underlying stats have still supported that Mahrez is the better pick. So with Martinelli, the reason why he falls this week is because I think Trossard has been brought on to hopefully start one of these games. Look, Arsenal's going to be playing in a very, very fixture condensed schedule. They're not involved in any big fixtures outside of the Premier League. But I would have to say that Martinelli is someone who I would expect to probably sit on the bench maybe 1 or 2 games over the next 8 game weeks. And the reality is, of course, Martinelli still is posting fantastic numbers. His underlying numbers haven't changed from the World Cup or previous to the World Cup. So I think Martinelli hasn't gotten any worse as an asset, but the reality is Trossard has come in. That's genuine kind of fighting for places. And if you look at Saka and his history with substitutes, also with Trossard and him playing in right wing, I don't really think that's going to be a contentious spot for Saka to actually lose. Saka is someone I actually think who's going to be playing consistently for 90 plus minutes per game. Probably more nailed actually than Odegaard, even though Odegaard has been that kind of central attacking player for Arsenal in the last 2 months. So Martinelli for me is someone who has to drop, sadly, because I think the priority has moved towards Saka and Odegaard. And Nketiah is an interesting one, because I think he actually has the best underlying stats. So even though I think I wouldn't say he's long-term nailed, because we have gotten some great news about Jesus coming back into the training, and of course the kind of rumor mill that was spurred on by Jesus saying that he would be back 4 to 5 weeks, probably around 1 to 2 weeks ago, when he was speaking to Khabib Nurmagomedov, that probably suggests that Nketiah's days are numbered, probably around after 25. And you have to think about your wider strategy with your team, because 26, 27, 28, those are going to be transfers probably built around blank Game Week 28. And if you're doing that, then you probably don't want to force another future transfer from Nketiah out of your team, because we want to be keeping triple Arsenal, because they will be playing in that blank Game Week in 28. So that's kind of why I feel like Nketiah is probably a little bit worse of a move now than someone like a Saka and Odegaard. I'd probably prefer Saka and Odegaard as an attacking pair up if you have that 1 defender setup. If you're going for a triple up, I can actually understand going for Saka and Nketiah and Odegaard, so that could be an interesting setup, of course. I'd prefer Nketiah over Martinelli at this point in time. If we move towards the second half of the midfielders, as I said, Odegaard, Mahrez, for the reasons that I explained when I was talking about someone like a Grealish, I think they're just more interesting. The underlying stats are there for Odegaard. He is actually consistently probably the one that probably has the most amount of expected points. Now, keep in mind, he doesn't have penalties over Saka, so that's going to be one thing that inevitably will probably come towards Saka's way. We saw Bruno score a goal through a penalty this week due to being the penalty taker. I think Saka will eventually get one. I mean, he's got 2 doubles in the near future. Eventually, Saka will probably reap the rewards of being the penalty taker of Arsenal. As far as Odegaard, I still think the underlying stats are fantastic, and they're comparable to any of the top assets in the midfield position, and he's got doubles. So we did, of course, see him get subbed off for Fabio Vieira for 1 to 2 minutes, but I think he maybe had a slight knock in that game. I don't really think he's going to be contested for minutes. I think Odegaard's a great pick. Mahrez, the reason why he stays at the top is just because I think he's a bit more interesting, a bit more raw as an asset. Of course, there's going to be the issue where you have to say probably Mahrez is someone you have to ship off before Game Week 28. But I think the kind of window here between 23 and 25 is super exciting. So I think keeping Mahrez for then is going to be interesting. Rashford unfortunately falls, not simply just because of the blank, nothing else. I think Rashford, of course, could arguably still be a green tier asset. But I think obviously when you look at how many fixtures he's missing out compared to players like Odegaard and Mahrez, that's the reason why I've dropped Rashford. As far as Gakpo, Look, he's a new kind of addition to the cheat sheet this week, and I haven't really been impressed by Gakpo whatsoever, but the underlying numbers are okay. Liverpool have been very, very poor lately, even with Darwin coming back into play. And I actually suggested that when Darwin would come back, that the attack would look much more interesting. And I think it has stepped up a little bit, but once again, we're still seeing a little bit of unclinicalness from Darwin. And for Gakpo, I think he could have probably laid off, let's say, Saka or Darwin once or twice in the previous match, but we're still not seeing any returns from him. I think he's still going to continue starting, but of course we have the news that Jota has come into training as well, so that's going to maybe shift whether we actually think Gakpo is a good asset. I might even drop him further next week, but I wouldn't say he's a transfer to consider until at least Game Week 25, when we get a bit more of an understanding of what Jota could mean for this Liverpool team, where he can play in the lineup and how that interacts with Darwin and Gakpo's minutes. For now, I'd say Gakpo is an interesting kind of addition to the cheat sheet, but probably one more to look at for 25 and to kind of ponder over for now. As far as Saka, of course, he sits alone at the top as the king in 8.0 to 8.5. As far as 10.5 plus assets, or sorry, just in general, kind of the premium territory, which is kind of why I've classed Fernandes here, even though he doesn't actually belong there price-wise. Look, Fernandes has to drop simply because the blanket just comes down to the difference in the doubles. Yes, Salah has been pretty poor, but you have to also say that De Bruyne has been super poor after the World Cup. The reality is that we have a lot of money in the bank. I think there is a good enough justification to say, okay, but what about Kane? And that's a fair point. If you're going for a Kane-Haaland sort of mashup, I think that's obviously better than going for De Bruyne plus Haaland or Salah plus Haaland. So I think that is the kind of point of view where I would say if you're in a structure where you've already gone for De Bruyne or Salah, I'd probably keep the both of them. I'd probably think about, if you're a Salah owner, by just keeping him the whole way through. If you're a De Bruyne owner, just ride him out until Game Week 25. Then you've got the super flexible move of going towards Salah in 25. Just make sure you have enough money freed in the bank just so you can do that. I know some people might not want to go to Salah at all because, of course, the numbers have been poor. But the underlying data is still quite strong for Salah. The reality is you have to be making that justification in your head, saying that Salah has pretty much fallen off or become washed as a player. I'm not ready to make that step yet. I still think he's going to do well, specifically over that double. So maybe you want a free hit to cover that and to avoid Salah in the future. But the reality is maybe De Bruyne isn't actually very interesting whatsoever. So if you make that kind of educated play towards going for Salah in Game Week 25, you can maybe think about, of course, going back to Kane eventually afterwards because of the impacts of the doubles and how that changes things for Spurs. Because Kane, of course, has been probably the second best premium in the game, hands down. So that's kind of my take on that. De Bruyne and Salah simply just rise because of the doubles, nothing else. They have been pretty poor, but I think the underlying data is still good. Yes, form is a genuine thing in real life. I think some people are within a form versus fixture camp. I'm kind of halfway through both, same with analytics and grass. And I've got to say, I mean, it just makes sense, right? The fixture's there, and I don't think I'm seeing nothing from De Bruyne and Salah to say they're not worth going into, and that's the reality. As far as the forwards, if we move on kindly towards that, it's an interesting kind of territory where a lot of assets have dropped, and that's simply because we have a change in the order when it comes to fixtures. Mitrovic maybe doesn't deserve to be a top asset. I think Nketiah clearly is the most interesting kind of cheaply priced striker at 6.7. And Nketiah, for me, as I said, is interesting specifically if you want to go for a triple Arsenal attack. If you want to go for a double Arsenal attack, I did mention, of course, that I think Saka and Odegaard is preferable towards Nketiah because you have to think about the long-term value of what going for Nketiah means. You have to think about the Game Week 28 blank, and you have to think about when Jesus comes back. Eventually, you'll probably have to book a transfer away from Nketiah. And unfortunately, because of the price difference between Nketiah and Jesus, that's going to make a kind of, or at least demand or necessitate a little bit of money spent in towards that upgrade. If you really want to go for Jesus then, or if you're not really interested in Jesus whatsoever, then you have to think about how you're going to rejig that money, maybe going back into someone like Odegaard at that point in time. As far as Johnson and Gnonto, look, Brennan Johnson and Gnonto were actually assets that I thought were fantastic, and specifically just to cover game weeks 22 and 21. Johnson had a fantastic goal in the first game week sort of fixture for Leeds, and then Gnonto kind of redeemed himself, even though he had a very, very lively game versus Nottingham Forest, where I'd say Nottingham Forest were bettered by Leeds in the first half, but actually were able to clamp down from a defensive point of view versus Leeds. I think Gnonto, of course, I've been talking about him for a while. He's someone that I did see when he was playing, and he got his international debut in the Nations League game versus Germany, and I have been very excited about him for a while. I know Leeds fans are even more excited of him, and we clearly see him get to start even after, let's say, Jesse Marsch was fired. So him scoring an electric goal versus United was very interesting. I think he's a very simple keep in your team for now, but whether I actually think about starting him in the future in Game Week 23, not really. But I do think Gnonto is definitely someone to look forward to in 24, 25, 26, even playing him specifically around Game Week 25 if you have the structure to do that. to do that already if you've already made that move to Gnonto. I think it's a very simple keep. The reality is, though, I think Gnonto does play in a very traditional left wing position. There are some games where he holds in a very, very wide territory and he doesn't really look to cut inside too much. Today he did versus United, but that's something I would like to see him do more often, because I think he did that very effectively for Nottingham Forest, except for a fantastic Keylor Navas save. So thinking about that, I think Gnonto is just an asset who's going to continue to develop, because he's a young kid. He's 19 years old and he's already shown so much talent so far already in the Premier League. So I'm very excited to own him as an asset going forwards. But whether he's essential for now, I would say no. Martial, of course, he just dropped because he is terrible and he's a hospital patient, and I don't really want to talk too much more about him. I'm so happy I went from Martial to Gnonto in Gaming 22 because I got the dividends finally in Gaming 23. But the less said about Martial, the better. Unfortunately, look, he's just not going to play or be fit enough to even be considered an FPL, I think, going forwards. You have Fernandez, you even have Sancho back, who looks very exciting. He looked very good in the Leeds game, so that's even one to think about in the future. 8.0 to 8.9, Tony falls, but that's only to kind of pair him up with assets like Watkins and Calvert-Lewin. Look, we've been talking about the Tony suspension. I don't really think that's going to be a thing that's going to factor in my thoughts, but the reality is he does have a blank game week in 25, and then Watkins and Calvert-Lewin have some great fixtures coming up. Now, of course, they both have poor fixtures in game week 23, Tony included. Watkins and Calvert-Lewin, though, have some great runs after 24, specifically because they don't have to play in the blank game weeks. And also, you've got that double game week for game week 25 with Calvert-Lewin. Hopefully, if he gets more minutes consistently, we get to see, for example, a continuous build-up minutes, specifically in that Liverpool game at Anfield. I'm hoping, of course, that you can benefit from going for a Calvert-Lewin transfer as soon as something like 24. 24 is an interesting window both for Everton and Wolves in general, right? Because they both have good fixtures, arguably independently in 24, and then, of course, you have the impacts of the doubles in 25. So whether you actually want to invest your Everton asset or your Wolves asset to be Calvert-Lewin is another question, but he could be one to think about. As far as 9.0 to 10.5, I've kept Darwin at the top simply because I think he looks exciting when Liverpool play. I think he's been more interesting than Gakpo and Salah combined, to be quite honest. And if I was able to spend money to move towards Darwin, I'd probably think about it over Salah as well. But sometimes it makes a little bit more sense for people with team structures where they have KDB to go laterally towards Salah. And I think Salah has had some good chances. Of course, he had a kind of half volley chance in the previous game as well, where he could have scored versus Wolves. It wasn't as bad as it looked, I think, in terms of it being a 3-0 game. Of course, terribly defensive start from Liverpool, but then, of course, they still continue to build some great chances. A great kind of expected assist from Trent towards Darwin, where he once again missed a chance. And then, as I said, with the Salah half chance, that could have been a game that was a little bit closer, right, for Liverpool. But the reality is they haven't been super clinical, and whether you want to invest into Darwin is a separate question. If you specifically have, of course, a structure like, let's say, Haaland and Kane, I think I probably wouldn't move away from Kane whatsoever in this run, because it's a very good run. He's shown that he's fixture proof. We know that Harry Kane's fixture proof, and there's nothing to suggest otherwise. So I would say it's a bit of a tough move moving towards Darwin if you're a Kane owner. But if you can somehow, let's say, save or roll a transfer in 24, then you could maybe go towards a Darwin structure in game week 25, and that could be a bit more interesting than Salah if you think Salah is not the asset to own. However, if we just move towards the defense now, I would actually encourage that Chelsea have been, of course, a rising team. So that's one of the teams that have been included in the cheat sheet through Badiashile and James. And structurally, of course, because of the way of fixtures, I think that's how the cheat sheet has moved for the defenders. And I think it's a lot easier to just simply say that assets like Shaw, Varane, Martinez have fallen. Varane, Martinez, the reason why is, look, after the double up, you probably have no realistic reason of keeping them. I'd probably think about immediately moving out for game week 23 for probably an Arsenal asset if you could, or a City defender if you'd like to do that. Of course, think about game week 28 and your team structure in mind. However, you could also just simply go for a Wolves asset as early as this week because they have a decent fixture too. And then if you think about, let's say, an Everton defender, that could be a transfer booked in the future as well. So with Duncan Botman, I think for similar reasons, because of the blank, they also fall. And I have to say that Trippier falls, unfortunately, but that's simply just because it has to be a short-term fall. He has some pretty poor fixtures. It's a run where I think it's not essential to start Trippier, for example, in 25, where he blanks, and in Man City in 26. But of course, you can still keep him for Bournemouth and Liverpool, and he probably is the asset that you'd like to keep from this Newcastle team. Whether you want to move away from Shaw is an interesting one, because I think he still had, once again, another fantastic game from the attacking point of view, and I think his combination play with Sancho was very, very interesting in that second half with Leeds. I think he got so much more involved in the game, playing these 1-2s with Sancho. And I really like how Shaw was able to make some great runs into the box. And so that's kind of one thing that I'm kind of keeping my mind over. I think if you have that spot where you have Bueno or Patterson, I'd probably try to move that spot first before actually moving out of Shaw, because I actually still think that Shaw is a great pick to go for in that Leeds game and then also in that Leicester game. As far as Rico Lewis, he still remains at the top. I think the reality is with Cancelo going out, and of course, this is going to be a little bit of an ode to Cancelo because I didn't do a cheat sheet last week. Thank you, of course, for the great memories, Cancelo. But now Rico Lewis is someone who seems to be, you know, the teacher's pet, really, of Pep Guardiola. And I can't really see him missing out in too many minutes, because it can clearly be seen that Pep, whether he plays a back three or back four, that he can insert Rico Lewis in the midfield just from a static point of view, or just simply as an inverted fullback in one of these structures in a back four. So I think the possibilities with Rico Lewis are endless for Pep, and therefore Rico Lewis is interesting. No goal threat in my opinion whatsoever, but at that price he could be quite interesting. As far as Kilman, he's going to be one of those top assets in this 4.0 4.9 territory, and I've actually also dropped Ben White this week. The reason why Ben White has dropped for me is because I am a little bit fearful of Ben White and him maybe getting another 59-minute sub in the future, because if I look at some of these fixtures where you have, let's say, Man City and potentially even Aston Villa, you do have some great wingers in some of these tough matchups here, potentially that could, of course, create a spell of a pro Ben White game. Arsenal do mostly attack through Zinchenko. He does play a little bit more of a holding role for this team. He kind of does a kind of gap spacing role where he plays with Saka very, very conveniently. I think he's a much better, ball progressive defender than someone like Tomiyasu, but potentially, of course, when you see that Arteta needs to clamp up a game for the last 20 to 30 minutes, we've always seen that Tomiyasu sub, whether it's late in the previous game, such as 88 minutes, or earlier, for example, in the United game, where he was actually called on to play and replace Ben White at halftime. So that's one thing to think about if you're a Ben White owner, whether you want to move away from him this week. I know a lot of people probably can't afford side grades this week, but I'd think about doing it now, because you've got such a long run of Arsenal games. Maybe over the long run, it will pay off to go off of Ben White to go into someone like Gabriel or Saliba, and that's why Gabriel and Saliba remain at the top. Ake and Akanji for me are the top two Man City assets. I don't really want to pick between them. Stones is still injured until 25, so I think these are two assets to think about under this current structure with Pep Guardiola. Now, I don't know if Pep Guardiola will actually find some sort of miracle sauce or a new kind of team structure or formation to play around, or some key players that he wants to kind of incorporate over the next few weeks. But under the current structure that he's employed post World Cup, these are two players that I can see are most nailed in the structure outside of Rico Lewis. So I think Ake and Akanji are probably the most interesting picks. Ake seems to be the more interesting goal threat, but then Akanji, I might say, might just be a little bit more nailed than Akanji. Now, whether it's worthwhile to go towards Akanji, I would say probably not, because I think Ake also, you've got to factor in whether he can play left back at times. But what Ruben Dias and Laporte are doing sitting on the bench, I have no idea. I think it's one of those moves where I have to say, based on the historical evidence, it is a good move to go towards Ake and Akanji, but I really don't know what Pep can dream up over the next 2 weeks. There's going to be Champions League as well, so you have to think about what Laporte and Diaz represent for this team. And I think there might be just rotation, right, inevitably. And that's going to be the unfortunate thing, where I think if you think towards the Nottingham Forest game or the Bournemouth game, that could be almost chances for players to be rotated. So it might feel a little bit hard to go into Ake and Akanji this week if you're forcing that transfer. I'd much prefer attacking moves for City assets. And then with Arsenal assets, I don't really mind a side grade, because you've got a double-double in the future, right? So that's the reality with Arsenal. Zinchenko has also been added to the cheat sheet because he's been fantastic. And as I was talking about earlier with the Chelsea assets with Badiashile and James, the reason why James is an exclamation mark is because he's slowly working his way back to fitness. I think I would not encourage going to James just yet. Probably would go for him after West Ham if you really, really want to force the James transfer, but we probably already have Kepa as well. So maybe doubling up so soon might be against your wishes. Badiashile is interesting if you want to save a little bit more money, and for someone who I think is going to be nailed for the foreseeable future. As far as Trent Alexander-Arnold and Robertson, as an Alexander-Arnold owner, I've been super dismayed. Look, the Liverpool team is woeful, specifically from defense. The midfield is probably better less said than anything, but they've got a double, and that's the reality. You probably want to keep these assets, Arnold and Robertson. You might even want to think about going into one of them for this GAMEWEEK 25, but after that, I'd probably think about bidding them as well as soon as possible, and that's just the reality. I think Kilman and Tarkowski are enablers to think about in the near future, and if you are a Ben White owner, I think this might be the week where you want to transfer out. I'm personally thinking about moving away from Ben White for Gabriel for -4. I've been speaking to, of course, a lot of my Arsenal supporting friends, and of course, they also I would say agree with me in terms of if you were to think about Ben White versus Gabriel and you were to take a -4 move this week, it's not going to be this week where you're going to be rewarded for going Gabriel. The reality is, if you look at FPL points, Ben White has actually scored very, very closely to Gabriel. I think he's 2 points off. The reality is, though, there will be some fixtures where maybe Ben White gets lucky. If you look at the Brighton game as an example, there could be a situation where he could be subbed off early and then actually he banks the clean sheet, as opposed to some of the other Arsenal defenders who don't. I still think that when you think about the goal threat of Gabriel, when you think about bonus points as well, which actually rack up continuously over time for defenders, that it's probably better to go towards Gabriel and Saliba and actually not worry about Ben White, because I think Ben White is 100% nailed, but the actual availability of substitutes is much better for someone in Ben White's position in terms of Tomiyasu. If, let's say, Arsenal wanted to rotate one game just to get a little bit of rest going for the team, then that makes sense to go Tomiyasu, because he's a much more capable and serviceable replacement than someone like Rob Holding is for Gabriel or Saliba. And that's kind of my take on that. But that's going to be my thoughts on the defenders. With the keepers, I have to say that Sa actually rises towards the top for me, because I think the Wolves fixtures are slightly better, and I also just have more faith in the Wolves defense overall, even though Everton just put out a masterclass versus Arsenal, where they actually not only actually got a great result versus Arsenal, but actually clearly deserved it. And you can even see it in the underlying metrics where Everton clearly did boss Arsenal. Arsenal didn't have much to offer that day, specifically from the attacking point of view. Maybe you can put it down to the Everton defense, but I would also say that a lot of Arsenal players did not step up on that day. And they looked pretty uninspiring. Whereas with Wolves, of course, they were close. I would say a bit fortunate to keep a clean sheet versus Liverpool, but they have shown some great results as of late. And I think the double is slightly better. And I would also say, just looking at, let's say, Pickford's matchup versus, let's say, Sa's matchup, I think I prefer, for example, game weeks 23 and 24, just that lineup of games going for Sa if you were actually to force that transfer. So I do like Sa for the short term a little bit more. Than I think Kepa still remains the top keeper, and Ramsdale, Ederson simply are the top keepers as well. Whether you really want to actually spend that money on Ramsdale, Ederson, as I said, it is a bit boring, and it has been quite boring to own City and Arsenal defenders. But the reality is, because everyone also has one of the rest in terms of Gabriel Saliba within the defenders, or White, or at least, let's say, Ake, Akanji, or even Stones in the kind of defensive position. So you might not feel like you're actually getting a lot of points for owning Rams or Ederson, but I think they're independently good assets, and that's kind of how you have to evaluate them. And that's going to be it for the cheat sheet this week. I know it's a long one. I just wanted to express my thoughts over 23 and 25, where we have some very important doubles to plan around, and also, of course, the blank in 25. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.